Before we continue, we would like to ask you, who among you is renting a flat, renting a house? More than half of us. Therefore, these things are touching us directly. They are affecting us directly. We are all suffering from this kind of gentrification and speculation in our city of Barcelona, that we are being expelled from those places where we believe we belong. We are losing our social environment. As Andrei was saying, the measures of rent regulations are not the only measures that should be taken in order to guarantee a right to living in a housing with dignity. They are not enough, but they are necessary. So the next expert we're going to hear for the next panel are going to tell us about Scotland, Berlin, and Barcelona strategies against gentrification. And this session will be in English because we are counting on the participation of two international speakers who will help us get a perspective about the issue. We have simultaneous interpretation for this. So the participants to the table are invited to come on stage. The spokesperson of the trade union of renters in Barcelona, Carme Arcarazo, wasn't able to come, so in her place will become a politologist from the City Council of Barcelona. Also, Megan Bishop, National Secretary Living Rent, the Trade Union of Tenants in Scotland, and Katalin Gennburg, Deputy to the Berlin Parliament for the ENG, and Lucía Martín from the City Council of Barcelona as well, in housing, working as a counselor for housing and rehabilitation. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Very well. So we'll start by apologizing Carme Arcarazo, who has asked me to tell you that she's sorry that she wasn't able to come. Neither she or nobody else from the trade union of tenants were able to come today. So it would have been nice to have the representatives from the different movements of the different citizen demands concerning the regulation of rents. Finally, she didn't feel well this morning and she wasn't able to come. Megan, as you can see, she's not on stage. She's coming. She's on her way. She's in Barcelona. She will join us in a few minutes. So our idea was to start with an intervention from each, where we would hear about the debates in each of the cities or the regions. And starting from there, we will have a discussion about the elements, political as well as instrumental and operative elements that will be relevant when it comes to having such important discussions around the regulation of rent. Therefore, so my role will be to moderate this session, but I will now give the floor to Katalin, Megan, and Lucia. Let's start with Katalin. She will briefly explain in 15 or 20 minutes what the situation of the regulation of debates will be in Berlin. Thank you, Katalin.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation here to Barcelona. And I will try my best to explain a bit about the so-called Berlin model. And yeah, it's not that easy to explain a special model, because we are like in the middle of new foundings of the legislation, and yeah, we all together, I think, share a big struggle on the rent regulations worldwide, as we are connected as well as rebel cities and fearless cities. So first of all, yeah, I'm coming from city research, but here today I have the pleasure to speak to you as a politician. So I will focus on presenting like a political perspective on what we did in the last 7 years in the Berlin Parliament in a coalition that is built on the Left Party, the Green Party, and the Social Democrat Party. I think if we talk about gentrification, it's a question of social security versus money making. And as well, coming from city research, I want to refer to Ruth Glass, who described gentrification in the 60s as, a dynamic that middle-class people with a lot of money come to the city and re-urban poverty neighborhoods for a new place to be. And so there's a new way, you can see how city develop in, in this way. Always people with a lot of money come to the city and broke neighborhoods become like the place to be. But what has changed since Ruth Glass described this way of how it goes with gentrification? We are now 70 years, 60 years later, and we have to confront this view on development, on gentrification, with a new era of digital capitalism. We have to keep in mind that now that we see how big international monopolies drive the city's economies in different way. We talk about smart city, we talk about Amazon, Airbnb, and BlackRock as big players shaping cities. So I think to talk about gentrification today is much different from what we talked about in the 60s with the view of Ruth Glass. And we have to talk about platform capitalism. And honestly, I have not the time to explain this today, but I invite you to read this book, which is in open access. You can find it on the internet. It's a new publication from researchers Anke Struver and Sibylle Bauriedl. It's called Platformization of Urban Life. And there's also one article of me in it where I describe how the financialization of the housing sector is working worldwide in the same model, and that we have to understand that Airbnb has driving the housing crisis the same way as Deutsche Wohnen and other big companies, financialized housing companies drive the housing crisis in the same way. And we all have to talk about data. We all have to talk about algorithms and what is behind the financialized model of the housing market and how it is driven in the era of digital capitalism. Maybe we can talk about this later in the discussion as well. So Berlin, what is the context? In Berlin, we have 85% people living in rent houses. It's much different from many other cities in the world. We have round about 4 million inhabitants in Berlin now. And we have, as you have in Barcelona, as well a problem with the federal state and the legislation of the federal state, because we are not allowed to do the rent regulation on the state level. We are dependent on the federal legislation. And as you may know, Germany is not Berlin. So we are dependent on the legislation made by deputies from Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and other states in Germany. So because of this, the crisis, the housing crisis is much different in Berlin than in other cities. We would need to have an own possibility to do the rent regulation on the state's level, and we are really asking our federal government to give us a possibility. If we talk about gentrification, we also have to talk about the history since 1990. As you may know, Germany was divided and Berlin was divided as well. So it is very important to talk about the youngest history of Berlin, because you have to imagine that the whole city was divided through a wall, and this wall strip was a big land space, and all this land was free after 1990. And if we talk today about the situation that we have a housing crisis and that we have no more places to build social housing, you can probably ask yourself, where is all the land gone to? So I think this is very necessary to show that the privatization of land went together with the privatization of houses after 1990, and as well with the financial crisis. So a common story between so many cities worldwide is the crisis of the financial crisis, the era of privatization since the 90s, and as well, like privatizing houses and a lot of public land. You can imagine who was in Berlin, who had been to Berlin of you once? So most of you may know Friedrichshain, like the place to be. Yeah, Friedrichshain is a district of Berlin, and if we look at the percentage of the city that was privatized, the land that was privatized since 1990, it is the size of Friedrichshain. So imagine the size of Friedrichshain was privatized as land units since 1990. That's why now we have no land to build new schools or social housing, and we are really suffering for space to to build new houses that we can regulate. Because of this history, we have now a very strong social movement in Berlin. In 2014, we had the first big referendum on the opening of the old former airport Tempelhof. You have probably been there. It's a very nice part of the city where people said, no, we don't want the government to build new houses on this spot, because in that time they did not believe that the government will build affordable housing there. They were afraid that it will be only another privatized sector in the city. So after this successful referendum in 2014, we had another referendum on the rent regulation, because in 2015, people said, it's enough, we cannot afford the rent anymore, it's getting crazy, we need to stop the rents. In that time, or let's say today, we are facing like the doubling of the rents since 2010. So the rent prices in Berlin are getting crazy. And this has a lot to do with the new financial constructions of housing owners. It has a lot to do with Deutsche Wohnen and BlackRock, that are the owners of a lot of housing units that were privatized by the city when the city was bankrupt. And this leads us now to the situation that people say, you government sold a lot of our houses, now we have the rent crisis, and now we want you to bring these houses back. And that brings me to the last big referendum, which you probably have heard of. We are now working with, is the referendum on the expropriation of housing companies. It is focused on big housing companies that are stock market oriented housing companies like Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia. And we are now having a commission that works until April next year, and then we are planning to have a law on the expropriation of housing companies that have more than 3,000 units in their company. And the idea behind it is not only to bring back the former privatized houses, it's also a question of what is a good ownership? How can social ownership work? And how can a big company manage their houses so that people have a good life in these houses, affordable and good, in good conditions? So this is what we are working on, and honestly, this is not the only thing we are doing. We have also the idea of social funds on the land. We are giving 250 million euros in a fund to buy land, to recommunalize land, to have it for public needs. As well, social housing and public ownership. We have in Berlin now 350,000 units. And as well, to say that if we recommunalize the houses due to the expropriation, if this law will happen next year and the years after, we will have as well 270,000 extra units. That brings us to an amount of more than 750,000 units in Berlin. As well, I told you about the Berlin rent cap. That was a law. We tried to regulate the rents in our own hands in Berlin, but the Constitutional Court in Germany said, no, you are not allowed to do this rent regulation. So I could talk about about this rent cap, but I will not because we don't have it anymore. But as well, we need the right of first refusal. That means the state can operate by taking back a plot from the market or a house from the market to save it for public interests. We have to talk about political challenges that challenge us together if we talk about the right to the city and we really want to confront gentrification in the 21st century. We have to talk about what metropolization in a globalized world. I think it's very necessary to talk about 30 years of metropolization, like the global city era, and what is now the end of this. We have to talk about the deregulation of the banking sector, the general financialization of public goods, and let's talk about tax havens. Let's talk about money laundering and oligarchy in the world. Because we are now discussing who can be good partners for a social city development. If we want to make good plans for the city and plan city planning as a social regulation of the city, then we have to talk about partners and who cannot be a partner. And at least legislative competence on state level, that is very limited. So what are we doing now is a law. We are now working on a new law, and hopefully it will happen. It's a safe living law. I tried to translate it. It's probably not the right translation, but let it be. Safe living law or a safer housing law, where we put in all the possibilities we have on the state level. And this is the rent regulation of all public units we have that are in our public ownership, which was not very normal, because we had a time when even public-owned houses were having market prices, because it's like they were also part of this crazy market system. So a rent regulation of all public units should be saved in this law. A limit of termination of personal use. That means let's limit the possibility to privatize a house and to kick out the family because somebody says, I need it for my own. This is also the idea to regulate this on the city level. As well, the transparency of the market. We are struggling very hard for a rental and owner cataster. We want to know who owns the city. And we want to know who pays what for the house, to have an overview what's going on in the city. As well, we need this for the expropriation, so we need it. The renters' participation by law should be made sure in this law, more eligible for social housing, and a new state office on housing issues to re-regulate the housing sector in Berlin. So this is like the new law, what we are constructing now, and it looks very good that the Green Party wants it as well, and the Social Democrats as well. So hopefully next time I come here, I can tell you about the big, great results of this. But this, in general, is what we are doing now in Berlin. In the context I tried to explain, and I hope it worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Katalin, for setting really the general framework of the discussion, because at the end of the day, rent regulation, which is what we're now focusing on, is just another piece of a policy design that needs to go beyond it and really try to address the challenge of gentrification, which is what we're suffering from, the right to stay, for people to stay in their homes, in their neighborhoods, and how do we make that possible, both in the long term, when all of these policies you were referring to, access to land, dealing with the financialization of housing, all of those are probably longer term policies that will take some time to build. But what should we do in the short term also, right? How do we make sure that there's no people that we miss, that we lose, in the in-between? So that's why we also have Megan today to tell us more about the recent developments in Scotland.
Yep.
Just like Berlin, Scotland has also been in the spotlight recently for the very powerful debates and activism that is happening around housing and around rent regulation and rent freezes.
Yep.
So if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, and what's the general situation in Scotland also in regards to the right to housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me as well. Apologies for my slight late entrance. Yeah, so it's interesting here representing an entire country rather than a city, but Scotland is a very tiny country with only 5 million people. So the national government is probably responsible for as many people as there are in a city council in Barcelona or Berlin, which gives an interesting perspective. I come representing Living Rent, which is Scotland's tenants union. We are a democratic organisation run by and for our members. We're not tied to any political party, nor any funders who could influence our demands. And our main goal when we formed in 2014 was to aim to tackle the power imbalances that exist between landlords and their tenants. First, just in the private sector, but now we have members across private and social rented sector. And we also have supporters who are homeowners, who are long-standing members of their working class communities, people who can't afford to secure a tenancy agreement, people who are living informally. All of us are fighting for the same thing, which is to build strong and fortify strong working class communities. And for that to happen, you need to be able to stay put. In Scotland, the picture has been quite dramatic. I mean, in the 70s, before this little policy called Right to Buy came in, introduced by Margaret Thatcher, who is notorious for her privatization efforts. Before that, more than half the population of Scotland as a whole lived in council housing. And within 20, 30 years, we saw rather than 60% of people living in council housing, that number is now around 8% because they were given, people who were long-standing council tenants were given the opportunity to purchase their homes. Suddenly, these things that had never had a price before and were seen as a social good were given a market value and a price. they became commodities and they could be circulated as such. When I'm talking about the housing crisis in Scotland, even though we no longer have that policy, it's important to get this sort of context and this foundation there to begin with, because the really stark changes are quite difficult to overstate how dramatic the changes have been. Unlike a lot of European cities, we don't have large landlords such as BlackRock who control the housing sector. It tends to be more small-scale local landlords. That doesn't mean, however, that they aren't as violent and as aggressive or organized. If anything, they can be, because it's more informal, the process of which they try and maximize the rents that they can be really, really quite horrifying. And as one of our activities that we do as a tenants union is we support our members through disputes with their landlord or letting agents. And before the rent freeze, after the pandemic, we were seeing, even when there were whispers of a rent freeze coming through, we saw landlords trying to hike up the rents by, 200, 300 pounds a month. Was that in euros? Like 150 euros, 200 euros, around that per month, which nobody could afford. Most people in Scotland are already if they're living in poverty, they're already doing so because of the high cost of housing and that alone. If not, they would find ways to evict people illegally, changing the locks. We had members coming forward and coming home one day from work and finding all of their belongings had just been thrown out in the street, and the locks had been changed, and that was their way of being forcibly removed. This is linked to gentrification, because gentrification for me is fundamentally about displacement, and it's about losing your home. Yes, things get more expensive, but the first thing and the most violent thing is it becomes more unaffordable and people lose their right to stay. And so we have to talk about loss, and we have to talk about the real violent cases when we're talking about fighting gentrification. So as a tenants union, what we've been doing since we formed is fighting on these individual cases as part of the reason. That's what keeps us going. The bread and butter of our organizing is stopping these instances. We also have to mobilize around unfair rent increases. Another thing with gentrification is that initial period of disinvestment to try and then maximize profits later on. So we're seeing tenants paying more and more for incredibly worsening conditions in their housing. So people constantly getting sick, paying sometimes £10 a day to try and heat their home in the cost of living crisis. So we have to fight against this too, to make sure that we're having somewhere safe to live before we're then displaced that way too, by having to move for our health, our well-being. All of these are a lot of the activities that we do as a tenants union, but the problem is that these only take on individual cases. It's easy then to put the blame on just one rogue landlord who, there are some that are notorious that sound almost like slumlords or gangster criminals that we have to organize against. And it's too easy to paint that as just an individual problem, and obviously this is structural. We are living in a system where housing is no longer seen as something that is fundamentally there to meet our human right to shelter, but instead is there to be bought, sold, or preferably rented for profit. And that's what becomes prioritized. Housing is circulated as a commodity to increase in value, rather than actually be somewhere that we can build a secure home. And so these structural issues need to be taken at the larger scale as well. I live in Edinburgh, and so where Edinburgh is quite similar, and where we see a lot of literature that we can relate to in Barcelona, is the proliferation of holiday lets, such as Airbnb. This is another form of displacement that we're fighting. I can walk up the road from my flat to my office, and 50% of the properties will have key boxes. They will be holiday lets. Each one of those could and should be, first and foremost, a long-term affordable home. So as a tenants union, we are also fighting the largest causes, such as Edinburgh City Council have a consultation running about trying to bring down and regulate the number of short-term lets, bringing in licensing so that all short-term let landlords have to be registered and have to pay for a licensing fee. We're hoping that that will also bring the numbers down. But another way that we're doing this is campaigning for rent controls. That's why we were invited here, because we won the rent freeze, which took a long time, and we've been campaigning for this. Well, we started campaigning for rent controls as soon as we became an organization, but the rent freeze really came into being during the pandemic, when we saw that most people were losing their jobs, rents were still going up. We either received furlough, which was a support payment of 80% of your wages, or if you are a tenant, you're more likely to be precariously employed, and so you wouldn't have that at all. You would have lost your income entirely. And so we thought we need to freeze rents now, because there's nothing stopping those going up when our incomes are either declining by 20% at the best case and vanishing entirely at the worst. And this has been continued pressure. Obviously, it's no secret that we are living in a cost of living crisis, with the energy prices going through the roof as well, despite the fact that large fossil fuel companies are making an absolute fortune off the backs, but energy prices really have gone through the roof in Scotland, partly because of the overall crisis across Europe, but also the fact that our homes are notoriously cold. There is even regulation in some parts of Edinburgh that stops you properly insulating your house. If you live in what's considered an area of heritage, you are not allowed to change your windows so that they're more efficient, because that would disrupt the feel of the area, and that would make it less attractive for tourists. So instead we have to suffer with cold windows, and we have to get sick and put up with it so that we don't affect heritage. So building quality is low, and continuing to go up, and our incomes are falling. In the past 10 years, where I live in Edinburgh, rents have risen by about 45% for a 2-bedroom flat, whereas incomes have declined in that time. 2/3 of the people living in Edinburgh that are in poverty are there solely because of the cost of their rent, nothing else being taken into consideration. So rents had to come down, and freezing them is a good place to start. This was a long drawn out process, so we were calling for this all the way back in 2020. But finally, the government got the message that this was something that needed to be done, and urgently. And so we were able to secure a rent freeze. It took 2 rounds of going through Parliament and sustained pressure, trying to make it seem as unthreatening as possible to landlords who were threatening to leave the sector should we put any kind of price cap on what they could charge. So far, they haven't left the sector with having a rent freeze for 2 months. The devil is still in the details, and there are things that need to be straightened out with it. So at the moment, the rent freeze will only apply within tenancies, so landlords can still find these ways to evict tenants and then hike up the rent. We are seeing cases of that coming through, despite the fact that the Scottish Government did also enforce an evictions moratorium during the winter. People are finding a way to maximize their profits still. But we're hoping that this sets a precedent that is really hard to ignore, that it's becoming not only increasingly expensive, but increasingly unaffordable to live and build a life in our homes. This is not just an Edinburgh thing. It's increasingly prevalent across Scotland. Rural areas have their own issues, particularly with Airbnb and holiday lets. Everyone wants to go to the Isle of Skye, but there's not enough houses to support a local community and a tourist economy there as well. So the policy picture is quite messy, but we are hoping that this sets a dialogue going forward with the government. They did promise in the new parliament, which is a coalition between the Scottish National Party and the Greens, some form of rent control by the end of Parliament. But we're concerned then that that means it's going to be kicked into the long grass. If it comes to the end of Parliament, then there's no guarantee that it has to be implemented before a new Parliament comes into session. And it could just be promising sweet nothings to tenants who are really, really desperately campaigning in order to try and keep put. And so we want to see this brought forward. We need to see this brought forward. A rent freeze doesn't go far enough when they've been frozen at a rate that is already much too high. So rents need to come down. They need to be linked to the property and not the tenancy, and they need to incentivize some kind of maintenance so we can stop landlords neglecting their properties until the tenants move out. Whatever they can do to maximize the profit, being cutting back on maintenance or hiking up the rents, because that's what housing is seen as for them. It is our home and it's their pocket money. So I think I can start to wrap up in saying that we still need to see more going forward, but as a tenants union, we are committed to this. And it ties into fighting for gentrification because we are fighting for that right to stay put. When we have a stable community, then we can start to campaign on other things like we're doing. Once you have an affordable home and you're not paying through your nose, you then have more time and more energy available to campaign for other important things like public services, keeping libraries open, keeping your streets well lit, having public amenities in parks. We need to get to that base level and start at zero before we can then start to build the communities that we as working class people and tenants and homeowners and people who want to build a life actually deserve in our cities. So it's a good place to start, and I hope that it continues to go forward with the momentum that we've seen, even if it scares landlords a whole lot more. But I'm excited to see where it's going. I think I can finish there.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. You've brought some additional topics to the discussion. I think the issue of the decoupling of the increase in rents compared to the increase or decrease of incomes, the issue of touristic apartments and other uses to the housing stock, and then the central issue of rent freeze as a first step towards a more solid reform of rent regulation or rent control. So now to Barcelona, Lucía Martín.
Let's move on to Barcelona. Lucía Martín, you have the challenge of situating the discussion of Barcelona in a similar context to what we can be living in Berlin or Scotland, obviously in quite a different situation, but also from the perspective of the city council that has the competencies that it has, which can combat the situation with instruments it has and which see the regulation of rent with it as a tool, but not as an immediate tool at their reach. How can we look at this from the personal perspective? It's more immediate than far away, I think. I want to be optimistic. In any case, I won't only be speaking about rent control, although this is what is on the spotlight right now and the limelight. But if we want to fight against gentrification, we need to put different instruments into action. The rent control, I will leave for the end of my presentation, but this is a demand that, as a city council, we have been asking for since 2015. The debate at a state level has been discussed since 2019, and there's a commitment from the government members to do this. What is being discussed is what kind of rent control. Barcelona has a 40% of its inhabitants renting their house. Looking only at these percentages, we could be looking similar to any other cities like Berlin or others. We have other differences, unfortunately, but this is an issue which, in our current context, with the increase of prices and the inflation, needs to be urgently resolved. And the state government has taken some measures to limit energy prices, to lower public transport prices. However, still, although there is an agreement for budgets stating that rents need to be regulated, there are strong resistances when it comes to the approval of rent control, which gives you an idea of the power it involves. The power, it sounds like films, but there are economic interests behind this, and they make it difficult still for it to change. This is in terms of gentrification, but I would like to highlight one of these phenomena with lower rent or lower income people. When a city is gentrified or when a district is gentrified, there is a change of use of the areas and the places in the city. We are in a very appropriate place to talk about this in Poplano, in this district where we are. Half of this neighborhood is now used for offices, commercial uses, and if you came with public transport, you saw that there are some areas which don't have a lot of life. They're just offices, blocks of offices. I will refer to some of the measures that the City Council has launched to combat this gentrification. And we'll see how important it is to look at all these changes in the use of the spaces, the change in the population, and how they are generating from the sociological point of view. It eliminates diversity, and it's expelling lower income people from the district with all the intersectionality that involves women with less income and wealth capacity, lower income people, migrants. What happens when you don't find people like this in your neighborhood? When these people are not seen in your neighborhood, then you won't need tools to give an answer or give a solution to these problems. It's like everyone will live in their own bubble. Have you heard of the Spain of the pools? What is being spoken about lately? This theory of urbanizations has been launched according to a series of ideologies which construct our outlook, according to which, why do I need public planning when I have my own thing, my own universe? It's a new phenomenon. Lately, I was reading in the newspapers about the figures of sales and purchases of housing all around the state. It seems that prices are being recovered, have been recovering, and they are reaching the maximum prices of the last years. After the pandemic, we've seen a stagnant prices, but a lot of the investments that were in other more profitable products are now coming back to real estate, and this is a growing tendency, a growing trend in the last years, in recent years. We are suffering this in the administration as well. It seems that we don't have enough data. It's easy to compare in terms of public stock of buildings. Yes, in Spain we have worse public stock of buildings than in other places in Europe. But how about gentrification? We don't even have indicators. We don't have an easy way of knowing what the kind of gentrification operations that are happening, how they're happening. The first thing I'd like to denounce is the lack of specific research and data that will allow us to see where we are, where the main process of gentrification are. We can see that with our own eyes. But beyond this seeing it with our eyes, who's buying, who's selling, when, how, where? Research is needed. Yes, we need a law, but we need data. We need evidence. Am I speaking too quickly, or is it okay? Can you follow me? Am I killing someone, or is this okay? Are you following? A lot of us know each other already. Should I speak slower? I'll try. No big deal. Where are these speculation operations happening? How many? Which prices? Who's buying? Who's selling? And for what? What are gentrification operations, these vertical operations? For what? Is it to extinguish contracts and to raise prices? Is it for timely rents? This is a practice that is happening. Big global operators from the city real estate sector are trying to avoid the regulations. So they are now doing shorter contracts, which are allowed by the law, but they are doing fraud. They're doing fraud with this to escape from these new laws, extinguishing contracts to raise prices, terminating contracts so that they can do touristic use housing. Luckily, a lot of people have struggled to fight this, and now we have a living regulation, PER-UAD, a plan to control touristic legal housings. This was a fierce battle that was fought against Airbnb, simply just to ask from this platform to announce only the apartments who had a legal license. This was the big battle, and also to limit the growth of the number of touristic housing in the cities, to establish limits in areas where this kind of touristic housing could not possibly grow any longer. Which gentrification techniques are we seeing? Neighbors being bullied so that they will leave, being persecuted, criminal activities, neighbors being harassed by the owner so they will leave. There was a house where for years the owner company, and I won't mention any names, but you probably, Laia, Cerberus, Blackstone, Solvia, one of these, okay, or some of these, more than one, owned a building. And I will not explain it case by case. It's just a couple of anecdotes so you will get an idea of what limits we come across as the city council when we want to act against this kind of phenomenon. It was a house that had been accumulating suing downs, people dying from drug consumption, and the owners were not denouncing properly what was happening there until there was a big owner trying to buy that house. And we were asking, trying to find out what was going on. For them, it was just a financial asset on a spreadsheet, on an Excel sheet. We ended up evicting the house to evict all those criminal activities that were happening there concerning drug dealing. But only started a case, but we were not able to expropriate it. Now the house has been rehabilitated and it is being sold at crazy prices, ridiculously high prices. This owner created all these problems. The city council carried out the eviction. We could not recover the ownership of it, but these apartments will be used for the gentrification of the neighborhood. This is one of the limitations that we're coming across with in one of these cases, and it has to do with norms that are not municipal, but rather it has to do with regional or even national laws. What have we tried to do from the city council? To end with rent regulation now, with rent control. What have we tried to do? What is still remaining? In a very compartmental and silent way, each will be taking care of their own tasks. The administrations are not thought to battle gentrification or to struggle against gentrification, not even at a municipal level. And this is not strange. Probably a few years ago, no administration was prepared to generate a public housing stock. Other levels of administrations were able to generate a public stock of housing, but they were not able to, which meant that we were not administratively prepared to struggle such a complex issue. Housing, emergency inspections, urbanistic districts, all these different fragmentation of factors were very difficult to tackle all at the same time. It was difficult to have one global whole policy for all of it. And this is some homework what we need to do. It's not, someone might say to me, why don't you start get onto it? Well, yes, we must. Yes, it's our task. What have we tried to do? The City Council of Barcelona regulation of Peruat, which was a long battle in order to limit the growth of touristic use housing. In the last years, Airbnb are still insisting because they want the possibility of sub-renting how rooms in their houses to be reopened. They have seen the possibility of rooms, and they are putting lots of pressure. Airbnb would like our municipal government to go away so they can open the door to touristic room renting. What other things have we done? We have a special unit for evictions. We have put a lot of energy for a public stock of housing. When we arrived in government in 2015, we only had 500 stocks. Now we have 4,000, and we have other strategies as well. I would like to focus on just a few measures that are trying to act on the stock of housing that is already there. We don't have a lot of municipal plots of land. Wherever there are speculation is wherever there is business and construction. But this has been possible also thanks to the citizens, because these movements were linked to the right of housing, trade unions, tenant trade unions, and other neighborhood groups that brought this to the plenary. And we have many good anecdotes. The 30%, for example, measure, which is aiming at big rehabilitations, not construction, rehabilitation, and not in the surroundings, but in the city center, which is where the main gentrification and phenomenon is happening, making this ownership to reserve 30% of their housing, of the whole housing being reformed to qualify them as protected housing, and therefore lower the price for these tenants. The real estate sector had a big reaction to this. We have only started with this in Mataró, in the town of Mataró. It was a very important ruling. There is a lack of housing at affordable prices. However, this measure has not been extended to other areas. And I have an anecdote regarding one of the main representatives of these sectors, which was against this regulation. There was a moment where, beyond the fact that, what is the background resistance? Beyond the fact of, not making more money. And the answer was, what sense does it make to do affordable housing in Sarriá or Pedralbes, in these rich districts? Maybe not there. The people who go live there will not feel comfortable, and the people who live there, they don't want that kind of people living there. Why don't we just maintain things as they are? And wherever there is no public housing. So social protection housing will involve that the city council will have a right of preference to buy this. But mainly the thing is to lower the rent prices. So what his argument was, you're going to bring low-income people to those rich districts, and they won't feel comfortable there. And the people living in those districts, they don't want them either. Let's do an exchange. Instead of 30% in this neighborhood, let's do them in let's concentrate that in the periphery, in the suburbs, but not in the center, not in these wealthy neighborhoods. But our idea wasn't that. We wanted to mix neighbors. We wanted to have lower income people also, nice apartments in Sarriá, in Pedralbes, in the nice neighborhoods. But you can see it's a mentality. It's ideological. It's ideological resistance, which has to do with rent, obviously, and with the capacity of making more money, obviously. But it's not only the money. It's also a different kind of resistance. Another of the strategies when it comes to elaborating budgets. Do I still have time? You do. The other one had to do with purchasing. The purchase of the day the 30% measure was approved, also the declaration of rights for the city was approved. Any house that is sold or bought in the city involving a whole building should be communicated to the city council. The moment we are communicated, we as city council, we have the right to buy the building at the same price that is being sold between two private agents. This measure, which whose efficiency will depend or whose capacity of making structural changes will be relative, because sales and purchases in the cities have certain prices and the city council budgets won't possibly be able to access to all of this. But this also generated a big rejection in the sector of promotion, real estate promotion. So this right of first refusal found a big resistance by the real estate sector and other sectors, because they said to us, you as a public administration, you should just give an answer to emergency for people who have nothing, and then just let the market to regulate by itself with offer and demand. Everything that we know, because it has been shown that it does not work. The only thing it works for is for rich to become richer and for poor to become poorer. We have bought 43 buildings. We have protected many neighbors who lived in these buildings. We have gained public stock of housing in places where we didn't have places to build, and we have limited the expulsion and expelling of neighbors in many, many cases. But the opposition parties are accusing us of competing in a sector that is not our sector. They are telling us it's unloyal competition. They are asking us to go away. However, fortunately, we have a law that is protecting us. And this is one other measure. I could also mention other things that we are lacking, and they don't depend on the city council. Apart from the regulation of prices, we should be talking about the stability of the rent contracts. We are very happy that the state government has approved the limits to the raise of prices, the increase of prices within the same rent contract to 2%. That was good, because it could have been more than that. It could have been a limit to 10%. But this is only the 3-year that in 3-year contracts. In other places in Europe, contracts are undefined or longer contracts, longer years, and reasons must be justified why a contract should not be renewed, and reasons why the owner should recover the use of the building. Therefore, yes, rents must be regulated, but we also must discuss the stability of the contracts. We must also talk about touristic licenses, limiting touristic use housings and illegal touristic housing. In Catalonia, I think we have about 90,000 touristic housing which have a permits forever. Like, it's crazy. They don't need to renew their permit. This is crazy. We could change this norm. The Catalan government could change this law. We have asked for this law to be changed, but we didn't see an answer from an answer from the other side. Also, the taxes. Which taxes should be paid for property that is bought, and then after a short period of time they are gaining big profits? These are debates that should start to be present. And price regulation, finally, there is a text that is gathered in our state law. This law has been stuck for months because there is a resistance and a disagreement, and the press has spoken about it, where the Socialist Party, one of the state government parties, is reluctant to approving an effective price regulation. Why effective? Effective in the sense that currently besides extending a contract, which can be demanded by the tenant, which would mean an extension of 2 or 3 years, those areas where tenants market is being declared, what we are proposing is that in the new contracts, where we have new tenants, let's suppose we have a new contract and we're asking for an extension. When the extensions are finished, the new tenants should have free price in case these are the owners are small owners, because half of the people who are renting a house in Barcelona are living in flats or apartments owned by small owners. However, the new contract should be referenced or limiting those housing in the hands of big owners, which would leave. That also depends on the definition of big owners, but it will leave out 60%. No, sorry, the 40% of the city houses or flats. This is where the regulation is stuck, because there is the idea that small owners should be protected and they should not be treated equally as big owners. We're talking about regulating prices, which since 2013 have increased in a 30%. We are maybe the country in Europe where people are having to spend the most money in paying their rents. The law has a tax competition for the small owners who are giving their houses to rent in regulated prices. So there is a compensation for small owners already. As far as I know, there is no other proposal for regulation that will establish a difference between the kind of regulation is applied according to which owners, which properties those owners had. Depending on how we define big owners, if big owners don't want to be regulated, they will have ways of dividing their property in smaller units. So distinguishing between big owners and small owners is turning this regulation into a regulation which won't even have half of the power it should. And we should not forget that this supposed regulation for big owners would not enter into force until 18 months after the law is approved. Only 1.5 years after, when all the big owners will have done all their strategies to divide their companies, etc. Well, so this is nonsense, makes nonsense. And this is why the law is stuck. However, from now to December, we'll make an attempt to approve it. The Socialist Party has made a move, and we, as the City Council of Barcelona, are watching over that so that the decision made will be effectively this law. But this is a law that wants to protect the tenants from the abusive rise of prices and increase of prices and that have been happening in the last years. One of the keys to success for this is that it's not a negotiation between institutions or between parties, but this involves, from the beginning, and there is a demand by the tenants to sit down at the table of negotiation in order to be present, so that these organizations will give their agreement to this regulation. And we have been pursuing this regulation for a long time, and that's it.
Gracias, Lucía.
Thanks so much, Lucy. I wanted to ask you a question, but I'd like to remind our audience that you can go onto menti.com and ask your questions. If you enter this PIN code through your smartphones, you can ask the questions you like, and we'll then show them on screen. Before opening up the debate, I wanted to ask you a question, which I'll be asking in English.
To a process which I think is common to the three cases, which is that tenants have really strengthen their organizing as a result of a worsening of the housing conditions and the housing crisis and gentrification, right? So there is this need has really pushed people to come together and advocate for political changes and policy changes. So I wondered, and Lucia was referring to this at the very end, right? The importance of these new community organizing and activism, social movements, pushing for policy change. And you know, in this more recent context and yeah, political context you all find yourselves in your different contexts and countries, what are the ways in which social movements by themselves can be more effective at making, you know, policy changes succeed, but also in working with politicians that are more sensitive to their you know, demands? What type of alliances can happen between social movements and political groups? In some cases, you know, certain levels of government, for example, local governments being more you know, responsive to their needs. What type of alliances can happen there to push forward these policy changes that you were all referring to? And maybe each of you can start. Megan, I see you're ready to jump. Please go ahead.
So, as a representative from a tenant union, the way the Living Rent organizes, we have a very sort of almost like a federation of smaller tenants unions, which is how we organize. So we are Scotland's tenants union, but Scotland, despite being small, is very diverse, and so we organize first at the very grassroots and local level. So we will have neighborhood branches, which can be only a few blocks of social housing or a few streets that will then come together for the issues that really matter to them. And they can be in touch with local councillors and then we build up to citywide forums or national forums where we kind of scale up our campaign. So at the local level, we are making a name for ourselves and building those relationships. While we aren't affiliated to any political party, we do have supporters in the Labour Party and the Green Party. Funny enough, not any in the Conservative Party. I'm not sure anyone will be surprised about that. But we can build those relationships with city councillors and our local MSPs. Because it's a small country as well, it's not uncommon to find your local MSP down the pub where you can start having a conversation about this. So a lot of it is these relationships, but we want to keep most of the power in our members to drive that. And so the way that we organize, underlining all of our tactics, is direct action. So we need to make a name for ourselves that way and find politicians that are sympathetic, but we need to make sure that it's what is empowering for our members is what is causing the wins. So we will, if landlords are abusing tenants, we will go to their offices and we will call the press and highlight exactly what they're doing and build power and share that way. And the more you win at those small victories, the more you then build momentum and appetite. Something about British people and Scottish people is we don't like asking for more, but we start hearing then that we can actually get what we want. So we build power at the small level, and that goes up then to our national campaigns, and we will make large actions outside Parliament to campaign for an evictions moratorium. We collected every single eviction that had been enforced and granted during the pandemic and delivered them to Scottish Parliament to say, this is what's happening under your watch. Look how many people have been made homeless during a pandemic. We're not afraid of doing that as well. So we will make sure that it's heard, it is publicized widely, and that we can share our wins. And that way people start to take us more seriously as well. And so we build more of a reputation for ourselves. And then we started to hear more recently that, well, we're being invited to events like this. More people have heard of us, and that's how we then are taken more seriously in the political sphere, rather than just being some rowdy tenants, which is what landlords like to present us as. I hope that answers. So all scales, I think.
Working? No.
I
Not
don't-
now.
Maybe
Can
I
you-
destroyed it.
No.
No,
No, it's okay.
Working again.
Because it was too close to my mouse. So I put it away. So now is it
Sí, sí, ahora sí.
You hear me? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I would agree. It happens on different levels, and it's very necessary to understand how protests change society directly in the situation, but also in the future. And if I tell the story about the housing protests in Berlin, like the movement and how it developed during the last 10 years, as I told before, with the referendum on the limiting of the prices for the social housing, for the public housing. And then we came to now having a referendum on the expropriation of big international financialized landlords. um, it shows where protest starts in the direct situation of myself having a problem with the too high rent and seeing all my friends paying too much money, and it goes to the general situation of what has to be done. And I think as a left party, we are very responsible to support these protests to make things happen. Because what we also see is, the funny thing is, you would think that if there is a problem put on the table from a movement and it's solved, you would think, okay, somebody is working on it, and then the problem is gone and the movement is gone. So, okay, we don't really solve the problem of the housing crisis, but we did a lot of things. And at the same time, the movement did not weaken. It grew. It grew more and more and more. And this is super interesting to see that the politics for another society, for another like social politics, at the same time you develop another way of politics, you can also see the movement growing that was asking for this. And this is really interesting, and I think we really have to see that a lot of things that are now staged in Berlin, like the expropriation, I mean, this is super crazy. When the initiative started, everybody would say it's unsayable. You cannot ask for the expropriation of somebody. So now people are asking about the expropriation of everything. Oh, why can we not expropriate? Even also, the conservatives ask, "You want to expropriate this as well?" So, expropriation has a new is a new instrument, and of course, we know from urban planning, expropriation happens every day, all the time. So, to really think this instrument to re-regulate in a social way is a new quality. And let me say as well, this shows that this overtone theory, saying a very radical thing, open up a way, open up a space for political action, opens up a space for a new thinking, and therefore I think we all have our roles in this, in this political system, and I think it's very, very important to have strong alliances and as well, to support this protests. And in this time where we see that everything is changing so quickly and you can feel the radicalization of the society day by day, I think it's very necessary to open up spaces to really think about a different way of making politics in a different society, and really have a way to make politics for a society that works not only on capital, that has like a social mind. And I think this is only possible to due to the connection of the movement and the government and the parties in the representation. Yes.
Bueno, yo no. Hola.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so they've said many things already. I'd start off with an anecdote. When I was talking about the 30% measure, which was contested by property developers, one of the first things they said, one of the first things the local MP said when that measure was adopted, I wasn't in the city council, they said, how did you adopt that measure without coming to talk to us? And we are the developers, you know, the real estate developers, and we've always been consulted for all local regulations. How dare you adopt this law without coming to talk to us and talking with these other people? Who are they, you know? They couldn't imagine. I mean, the rule was adopted consulting and with the participation of all the people who had suffered from all of those measures that had been adopted by the previous local governments who had consulted with real estate developers. These were the people who had suffered all of these measures and who are now a legitimate interlocutor with whom we consulted when it came to adopting regulations. And if I look at the situation in Catalonia, not so much in Spain, but all of these movements defending the right to decent housing have gained in legitimacy in recent years. And this is explained because when we started to see a massive surge in evictions because people weren't able to pay their mortgages as of 2018, those who were out in the streets trying to stop these evictions and supporting these families, it wasn't the institutions, it was the neighbors, it was the social movements. They were the first to respond to a problem, which then came as a tidal wave that destroyed the lives of thousands of people, coming up with concrete solutions to concrete individual problems that were affecting. They say, we'll go out and stop this eviction because the people being evicted have a name, they're individuals. They were the first to give a collective dimension to a problem that institutions were totally blind to. And I'm sure it stems back from much longer, but with the tenants union and the platform to stop evictions, you know, when it comes to protecting the right to housing and the rules that have been adopted in the last 7 or 8 or 10 years, they were pushed for by those movements supporting the right to housing. So they've gained a lot of legitimacy. They were the frontline people out there to defend people who are being evicted. They came up with short-term, immediate responses, combining this with long-term proposals. They wanted to interact with the institutions. They're not just organized at a neighborhood level. Well, they should say this better than I, but I think they are movements that are connected internationally, that can network, who are strongly rooted in our towns and cities. They're also present in the academia and institutions. They are listened to by the media. We can no longer ignore them, and we from the institutions have to do what they've done always traditionally with the real estate developers. They were before the main lobbyists. What you have to do is to give legitimacy to the people who've been fighting for the right to housing for years and listen to them and allow them to be an actor with making up proposals and sitting at the negotiations, and you have to have an ongoing dialogue with them. And then as an institution and as a party, obviously you're subject to limitations. The work of social movements is very different from ours. They're completely different roles. We from the institutions must listen to what they say. We must be open to criticism as well. I mean, one thing is having them as allies, but a different thing would be to try controlling or dominating these social movements, or to be the executive arm of a political movement. So I think the role of parties and institutions is to listening to their demands and knowing that we are also exposed to their criticism. Great. Okay, so it's now 6:25. I know Lucía has a commitment later on, so maybe we could open up some time for questions, 10, 15 minutes. If we have received questions through Mentimeter, we have 11. Well, maybe we don't have time to go through the 11 questions. The first question, there are many similarities between Catalonia and Scotland. What would we need to implement the measures that they're suggesting in Scotland here in Barcelona, Catalonia? I guess they are referring to the rent freeze, which does have a parallelism with what Lucía was saying in order to limit the increases in rent prices to 2% during the lifespan of a contract, which leaves out what Megan was saying about the increase that happens between contracts. So I don't know if Megan and Lucía, maybe you'd like to try answering this question together. Megan?
So what's different in Scotland to Catalonia is that housing policy is completely devolved to the Scottish government. So that is entire. I don't know if that's the same here or.
So rental contracts here depend on national law.
Okay.
Whereas some other housing policies
Yeah.
happen at the regional level, but not rental regulations, for instance.
So rental regulations happen at the national level, but that is in Scotland rather than Westminster, so rather than London. So we have in the Scottish Parliament, I say we, I am not in the Scottish Parliament, they have entire jurisdiction over rental agreements. That doesn't mean that it has necessarily been easier to implement these policies. Something that's been quite interesting is that I'm a PhD researcher and I'm researching the housing crisis in Scotland, and I happened to find that nearly 20% of all members of Scottish Parliament are private landlords themselves. So there are certainly vested interests that we have to fight. But it does mean that it's a smaller basis in which it's easier to hold people to account. But the Scottish Parliament does have more jurisdiction over housing policy, which is why we have had the diversions from Westminster in terms of implementing the rent freeze and a moratorium on evictions. It does also lead to some interesting pressure points, such as, for instance, during the pandemic, Westminster were actually implemented an evictions moratorium before Scotland. So we were able to say to the Scottish National Party, who like to present themselves as being quite social democratic, we were like, look, you're being outdone by the Conservative Party in terms of protecting tenants. So it gives us, as a movement, it gives us more space to kind of humiliate them into to doing what we need to and holding them to account. But the target is smaller, but there is more that we can do with the power that the Scottish government has. So it would be interesting to hear what could happen here.
I didn't specify this yet, but in Catalonia we did have a rent regulation for a year and a half, and it was approved thanks to the pressure of the movements, which reached a majority in the Catalan parliament, but it happened the same as what happened in Berlin. The Constitutional Court, after the right-wing party presented an appeal against it, the Constitutional Court decided that it was the state government that needed to regulate the rent prices. And now we are at a different situation. Decision spoke about regulating prices, but this needs to be worked on at the level of the Catalan parliament. Probably we would go beyond where we are in terms of durability, stability of contracts. Until now, only state laws had been dealing with this, but we are fully into these times. Can we move on to the next question, please? Should we limit the purchase of prices for investment funds? Well, yeah, we must do something. It's clear enough. Something must be done. The example that I was giving is a paradigm, is prototypical of investment fund of a house that has lots of problems. We end up solving their problems for them, but because we don't have the money to buy the building from them, they end up being gentrificating buildings. I think there are measures, not so much or not only in terms of price limitations. I think in Amsterdam there is a measure limiting the once you bought a building, you cannot sell them right away. You have to keep that property for some time. But I don't know, this would be the specific formula to be adopted, but obviously some formulas like this, or indirect formulas, should this be limited? Yes, of course, but we will find state lawyers that will tell us this is attacking private property, private ownership. So we would have a lot of difficulties for sure. We would come across many obstacles. And also, what happens when you buy these properties? What do you do with that property later? Do you buy them to establish stable rent prices? What do you do with them? I would say yes, but I know this is going to be complicated. So maybe I'm thinking such an institutionalized way that I cannot think out of my box, out of my institutional box.
Berlin, you've been trying to acquire back some of these more speculative, acquisitions that happened in the past. So should you try to prevent them in the first place?
Yeah, I think in general we need a land reform. I mean, it is shown that we all have these private investors. Also in agriculture, we have the same problem everywhere in different contrasts. And I was just, thinking now. It's very interesting. It all started with the banking crisis here in Barcelona. Not it started, but like the revolt in this issue, as far as I understand, started with the banking crisis, and now the banks are not away. They are still there. And we still have the problem with the banks. We still have the problem with the financing system behind everything. And it comes to the question, why is BlackRock that such a big power? It has to do with the banking system and the digital finance system. It is all connected, and we really have to have a focus on these questions and how it is connected to the general question that properties should be guided by a social use, and how we can bring this together, and that therefore we need this transparency register and so on. I was just thinking, I mean, we also have to forbid share deals. I don't know, I mean, share deals, probably as well, is like if you have a housing company and you sell a part of the company as it were just like a company. But it's houses. It's not a company. It's not just 50% of something. It's like 150,000 housing units. And this should be forbidden, to sell houses as share deals, also for the taxes and so on. And so I think the whole financial system should be guided in a new way, a new social way, and especially to re-regulate the housing sector, we really have to confront the financial system. Yeah.
You want to add something on that, Megan?
Something that was just in the back of my mind when the rent freeze came into being in Scotland, is we had a number of landlords saying, "This goes against my fundamental human right to profit." And so that's a resistance that we hear a lot, is this right to profit being over a right to live. So I heard that question and thought, of course, no way, nothing more to add in there, but surely the right to shelter and that fundamental human right should come above the right to squeeze an asset of everything it's worth.
So the following question, I think, refers more to the solution to these conflicts, right? So the question goes, which success stories can be explained regarding public-private partnerships so as to provide affordable housing both in rental, sale, and other tenures? So is there a room for some of these investment funds or investors to collaborate with the public sector or the organized civil society as to deliver some of the housing units that we need to create? What's your stake on that?
So am I to answer this? Okay. Well, success stories. The answer is public-private partnerships, because if we are talking about public-private complementary or public-private cooperative, we do have examples for those other things which are working, and they are alliances with the sector. Social promotion, cooperative promotion, or cooperatives, where there's a session of housings where to which we have begun a financing framework for social and cooperative housing in the city. We will have some success story related to public-private partnerships. We hope so. We have started. Let's see what they will tell me from Berlin. They will tell me, don't go in there. Well, too late. We In the last 4 or 5 years, we have been generating an administrative project where a public-private partnership will be done at 50-50%. The administration, a city council, and a supramunicipal administration. If I tell you metropolitan area, you might not understand, but it's a bit beyond urban. Well, we are 50% owners of this project, where the private partners are doing investments all around the world. We don't approve of that, of course, but what are the guarantees that the project might be different, or that it could redefine what a public-private partnership could be? And we have 100 different examples in this country, which is to squeeze as much juice out of the private as we can, but that doesn't involve right to housing. The idea is that ownership will not be lost in these cases. The plot will not be sold. The plot will still be municipal, still be public, and the housing being built, and this has been written in the bid. Maybe a different government will decide to do otherwise and change the conditions. A different government might decide to sell this stock of housing, but our idea is to do affordable rent housing units. And in Catalonia, we've had a law for the last 3 years foreseeing that the new housing units of rent built on protected plots of public ownership will be protected, and we've invested a lot of money for many years in public housing, but not for rent, but for sale. And that's a difference in the project. The plot is public, the rent prices and the land is public, the rent are taxed and are in the administrational law file. They cannot make more profit than the one established, and the rental housing will never be sold. They should always be rental, and the city council obviously is committed to intervene if there are problems when it comes to paying the rent and by contributing with this housing. We're only starting to see the first projects with the first bids, and the first sites, construction sites, will come next summer. And the future will tell whether this is a success story or not. But in the future, we'll have to see how the neighbors are involved in the management and participation of this stock of housing. But yes, we have launched ourselves to the adventure to try and use this investment capacity that public administrations also have, and we have a 2% of housing stock when other places in Europe have 30%. So this proposal is done from the situation, a specific situation where we are. So
I have to think about this question for longer, but my first impulse was to say, no, there aren't, because public-private partnership is not like what can we do in a collaboration between some public and some private. It is based on a concrete model. So the public-private partnership model means the private gives the money and the public can rent it from the private for a money that is told by the private. So in this relation, there are, I think, most worse experiences.
Perfecta.
And it's the totally wrong way. We have to tax the private and have to get the money to the state to do the public things we have to do. But if you ask for like partnerships between public and private that really works, of course there are examples. Like Lucia said, it's so many things, especially in city making, where the private actors work together with the public. There's a lot of examples, but honestly, in house building, like we have the social housing sector in Germany that was for so many years financed from private investors, and then subsidized from the public with extra money, and it all came to the end that the rents were higher than any private rents, and the public has nothing from this social housing anymore, and it was gone after 30 years. It was not a social housing anymore, it was just a free market house. So we have a lot of really worse examples, but we can of course concentrate how to bring together like public and private interests, and there we see we need corporations, we need like housing cooperatives to be supported by the state, supported by tax financiation. And as well, in Germany, we had until 1990 in Western Germany a non-profit housing sector that was tax financed by the state, and who was like companies that were part of this non-profit sectors with non-profit housing got a special tax privilege, and we with the Greens and also part of the Social Democrats are asking for this, getting this sector back, because we need a special sector that is not a market-oriented housing sector. And of course, this model from the 70, 80, 90s in Germany was good, and we really need a housing sector that is not a profit sector. So this is of course also a good example for public-private partnership.
You want to add something, Megan?
Yeah, I have to admit, my instant reaction was also like yourself to go, no. We have in Scotland now, in Glasgow, Glasgow City Council was at one point the largest residential landlord in Western Europe, and now it has no council housing whatsoever. That doesn't mean there's no social housing, however. Instead, the social housing is managed by these organizations called residential social landlords, who are profit-gathering public sector landlords. So they're really messy, and their finances are quite hard to unpack. But this is kind of what came to my mind when I thought about a public-private partnership. It meant that the land and the resources were sold to a private company with social tenants. And in these cases, we found that actually the benefits of this model are privatized, so the profits are kept in private hands, but all of the risks are socialized and put onto the tenants. So it doesn't balance things the way that we would like to. I would like in Scotland to see more housing cooperatives, and maybe rather than public-private, we have more community partnerships. Not to use it as a buzzword, but it would be more democratic. The decisions would be made on a smaller scale. I would like to see more support for this. We don't have many of them. Most are organized by students in student housing, but perhaps this could be a model that we take elsewhere. It works really well in the cases I have seen in the city. So rather than public-private, more community partnerships.
Okay, great. Can we have one last question? And I think we're going to wrap up. Com es pot frenar la gentrificació davant les actuacions?
How can we talk of gentrification with regards to measures such as the justifying gentrification in terms of new investments and service?
That public administration or the public investment is not triggering gentrification. How do we prevent that, and how do we account for that when we design public policies?
It's like a really, really crucial question. Yes.
That is a tough one. I think there is this dialogue in urbanism in particular where it seems to be that the options are gentrification or disinvestment. And that's a false choice. There has to be a middle ground where we talk about rehabilitating and keeping money in the sector and keeping it for the people. It's more democratic, but it doesn't go to a private corporation. I find as a geographer, I find the dialogue really frustrating that I can talk about one or the other. Gentrification is not the only option for neighborhoods that are struggling. Instead, we can reinvest and keep that money locally. By investing in social housing, by investing in public utilities and taxing that back, and actually keeping the benefits and the structures for the community and making sure that everyone who is inhabiting has a right to the city rather than it going. And I know this is very vague and I can't think of policy prescriptions, but there is an attitude there that needs to change about how we think about our neighborhoods.
I think, I mean, the city is just like a small pattern of the whole society, and all inequalities we see in society in general, we can see very clearly in the city. And so gentrification is a lack of equality. So what we can see with like undertaxed rich people, we can see the results in our cities. We can see if people are too poor, we can see this in the cities. So if we talk about what can cities do against gentrification, we are always discussing how can we deal with the unsocial politics in general. So we always have to balance, even in schools, who is going to public schools, how many private schools do we have? We always have to balance the question of income and different class income in the city. So I would say in general we have to balance that people are not poor and that people have a right to stay in their neighborhood and to find a good surrounding that exclusion is minimized as much as we can, and this is what we can do. And in a very optimistic future model, I would say it should be that housing is not is not determined by the owners, it's determined by the social use. And if this would be by law, we would not have this problem of gentrification, we would not have the problem of empty houses, we would not have the problem of Airbnbs and so on. We would have the use of a house for living, and then it could be many things in a city could be much easier, and this could be done by a law, I think.
Jo és que crec com que he parlat una mica d'això abans i elles dues també.
Since I mentioned this before, and since it's quite late, maybe Lucía says she talked about this before, so maybe we can wrap up here. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Thanks to our audience, thanks to our speakers, and with that we will call it a day.
An amazing session addressing necessary topics such as housing speculation, rent control measures, alternative stands, or the fundamentals of the right to housing. Gràcies per intentar compensar la balança o dir.
Thanks for trying to balance things out between the profit of just a few with the collective need to decent housing, the pocket money for a few and the home for all of us, as you were saying. So with this interesting session, and you also touched on issue of public spaces, and in fact maybe if we had the team of 300,000 kilometers per second, which is drafting the soil land use plan for the neighborhood of Eixample for the super island in Barcelona, to avoid any negative collateral effects, to avoid acting as a catalyst of gentrification. But I'm sure this would be something we could talk for a whole day. So with this very interesting panel, we wrap up our day one of this 2022 forum on urbanization and refurbishment, but we're not leaving and going back home yet. We also encourage you to discuss, and that is why we invite you to attend a meeting between professionals and public actors in the sector under the tent and in this beautiful space in the middle of Poblano. So thank you all very much for being with us. Even if it may be a bit cold in this room, even then we thank you for being here. We invite you to be back here tomorrow in this room at 9:30 in the morning, because we will continue talking about sustainability, housing policies, refurbishment, and some of the things that we've put into practice. Thank you all very much, and see you hopefully tomorrow.